Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much. It's really great to visit here, Minnesota. It's the first time I've spoken here at the University of Minnesota. I realized it's the first time I've ever spoken at a university whose mascot is actually a rodent. I guess Oregon State would be. Is there anybody else that would be? Anyway, that's a first for me. Always like to tick off those firsts. The real reason I'm here is the University of Minnesota has been on my radar for quite a while, and Ione in particular, and well, also, of course, people like Dave Tillman, Peter Reich, and others who've had very prominent research programs here for a long time. But increasingly, the stuff with Ione and all the work that's going on here has been crossing our radar. And we've just had a very interesting discussion with John's lab and some of the work going on there, and there's just some very interesting areas of what I hope might be some potential synergy in the future. So this is an exciting place to be, really, truly an exciting place for me to visit. So this is a talk entitled The Future of Biodiversity, and I'm keenly aware that a title like that just sounds like sort of dripping with hubris. I mean, how could somebody talk about the future of biodiversity in one talk? But the idea of this is to sort of highlight some issues about uncertainties about the fate of biodiversity and how much biodiversity we have and that type of thing, and hopefully focus in on some of the areas of uncertainty and a few controversies along the way. And I'm pretty sure most everybody in here has a science background, but my understanding is that there's a bit of diversity. So I apologize to people who are, hardcore biologists, because I understand there's some people in here that haven't had a lot of science background. If anything I say is a little too basic here. What is biodiversity? Obviously, I think a lot of us have a pretty good idea what that means. Many of us, when we talk about biodiversity, of course, we think about species. Counting species. How many species do you have? How many species are there in a particular group? And in a lot of ways, that's kind of a shorthand way of talking about biodiversity. But I think, by the way, I've been told this is being webcast, so I shouldn't use my laser pointer, which I have a terrible laser pointer habit. I'm going to just use this little pointer here. So. We all talk about species, but of course, biodiversity is sort of like a multi-layered cake, and there's lots of layers below the level of biodiversity that are very important. So for instance, if we look at species here, this is some different tiger salamanders out on the west coast. You can see there's a great deal of obvious morphological variation, but that reflects in that particular species, but it reflects physiological variation, genetic variation, adaptive variation in a lot of cases, which has probably some kind of role that makes the species, better adapted to its local environment. And we look around at lots of different species, and here's crimson rosellas from Australia, and here's a species of snail, and it reflects in species behavior and all kinds of things. But here's some calls of anemone fish in different parts of their geographic range, and they're really very distinctive. The point being, there's a huge amount of variation within the level of species, and that's also a crucial part of biodiversity. And in many ways, it's the raw substrate, it's the raw fuel for evolution. If you don't have that variation, of course, your capacity to adapt to environmental change and environmental challenges is extremely limited. Above the level of species, of course, we also have stuff too. We've got species interacting in communities and in ecosystems and biomes, and you can see this playing out here. In many ways, this is where the rubber of evolution meets the road. It's a complex, that whole range, myriad interactions between species, among species. This is where a lot of the reality of evolution plays out, is in this incredibly complex interactions among species and also, of course, between species in their physical environment. Well, how much biodiversity do we have on the planet? That's a pretty good question. Turns out, there's a lot of uncertainty about this. It's interesting. If you look at some groups like terrestrial vertebrates, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, we've got a pretty good idea of how many things are out there. This is a new species of jay right here. It's been discovered in the Amazon. It doesn't even have a scientific name yet. So there's still, even among birds and mammals, which are probably about 90% described, there's still some new things. This is a flying fox, which was recently discovered and described in the Philippines. This is about a 2-meter-long monitor lizard, which is also recently described in the Philippines. But the vertebrates themselves, the terrestrial vertebrates, are fairly well known. Probably 2/3 of the reptiles and amphibians have been described. But then you start getting into some of these other groups, and what you start seeing is our uncertainty about how many life forms share the planet with us are just wildly more uncertain. So for instance, here in fungi, there's something less than 100,000 species of fungi that have been currently described based on current estimates. And by the way, these are not wild-eyed numbers from people without credibility. These are actually mainstream estimates in the refereed scientific literature. The kinds of numbers that we're talking about here range from somewhere between maybe you know, 500,000 species and 10 million species of fungi altogether. I mean, again, that's a plausible range of estimates in the mainstream literature. Talk about insects, a little bit less than a million species have been described altogether. Mainstream estimates range between maybe 5 million and 30 million for insects overall. We know that if you go into a rainforest and you fog the canopy with an insecticidal fog and you catch the insects that fall down, then take those and go to taxonomic experts in museums, many, oftentimes 80% or more of the species that you'll encounter will be completely new to science. So an awful lot in some parts of the world are unknown. Some people think there could conceivably even be as many as 50 million species of arthropods. And then deep sea species, of course, this isn't a taxonomic group here. How many are known? Well, who really knows? But the range of estimates vary over 100-fold between perhaps 100,000 species and 10 million species, depending on the sampling method and the method of extrapolation and lots of other assumptions. So the bottom line is, wow, there's just a huge amount of variation in terms of how many species, you know, share the planet with us. And it's interesting just how strikingly variable some of those numbers are. So, well, why is there so much confusion? I mean, one possibility is simply that biologists are not very competent. I mean, it's a possible explanation. I mean, maybe we're just not very good at what we do. But I think actually there's some reasons for this. I think there's actually some real reasons why this. I think, in fact, that a lot of the species that we haven't yet, quote unquote, discovered, that are missing, haven't yet been described scientifically, tend to be different. And in some ways that's a little bit alarming because it tells us that we're developing or have developed sort of a biased view of life on Earth. One of the reasons some of the species that we haven't found yet is just simply because they're things that are not very easy to find. Here's just 3 quick examples here. This is a Sicilian, which you know is a sort of a strange amphibian thing. This is the first species of Sicilian that was ever discovered in the Indian subcontinent. It's a new species. Not only that, it's a completely new family. It was only discovered after 1,100 hours of digging holes in the ground. Okay? This wasn't something that just popped up in somebody's backyard. Somebody had to work for this one. Okay? Here's a species of chameleon here discovered in Madagascar. It's the smallest known species of lizard in the world. Okay, now this is a little lungless frog here. It only lives in certain waterfalls in Borneo. Okay, it's completely lost its lungs. Doesn't have any hardly except for very rudimentary lungs at all. It lives in these very cold, fast-flowing streams that are very highly oxygenated. It gets all that oxygen it needs through the skin. So it's sort of a unique kind of frog species. So it's, you know, that's one of the reasons is that some of the things that we haven't discovered yet are oftentimes just living in places or in circumstances which makes them hard to find. Another major category of things that we haven't discovered yet are the restricted endemics. These are things, of course, that occur just in a very small geographic part of the world. Here you can see, looking across the Amazon basin, this is looking at locally endemic species of vertebrates. So you can see here, as we look across and we look into the flanks of the Andes, we can see very high concentrations of locally endemic species. Now, lots of species occur in the Amazon basin itself, but most of them have broader geographic ranges based on what we know. But you find species that have small, oftentimes tiny, relatively tiny geographic ranges in sort of different kinds of restricted and unique environments. You can see here, here's the number of restricted endemic frogs, which are defined as having geographic ranges of less than 10,000 square kilometers. And you can see here in Brazil, so this is the number of these restricted endemic frogs known in Brazil, and you can see how many of the frog species being described are restricted endemics now. In the first couple of hundred years in Brazil, there was only about 120 species of these restricted endemic frogs described. In the last 50 years, there's been more than 200 species of restricted endemics frogs described. So a lot of the things that we're finding now, a lot of the new species that are being discovered are in fact things that just occur in a very small part of the planet. And then finally, the other obvious category of things that are being discovered and are not so easy to encounter are the so-called cryptic species. And these are things that are just sort of morphologically similar and not obviously different as species. This is one particularly striking example. This is from Costa Rica. It's a species of butterfly. The adults of all these butterflies look almost identical. It was all just considered geographic variation of a single species. Then they started noticing that the caterpillars looked very different, and in fact they found that the caterpillars were feeding on different host plants, and that was really a giveaway because that means they would have different physiological specializations with dealing with the host plant's chemistry. Turns out, after they did DNA fingerprinting, it wasn't one species of butterfly, it was 10. So in fact, now using modern DNA technology, about 60% of all the species that are being described now are in fact coming from these cryptic complexes. And of course, they focus in on highly rapid evolving sections of DNA, such as in the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. And this is an incredibly powerful technology, which is really being very powerful now and used in a lot of contexts. So that's, there's reasons why we don't, there's reasons why there's a lot of biodiversity that hasn't yet been discovered, and I suppose the hope is that there's new kinds of technologies, the DNA technologies, and also things like crowdsourcing and other kinds of things that are coming into play that are going to give us a fighting chance to trying to discover and to describe a higher proportion of what's sharing the planet with us. Where's the biodiversity located? That turns out to be not so much a mystery, at least at a very broad geographic scale. We look here across the planet. I think most of us would guess this. You get a lot of diversity associated with wet tropical regions. Also, another kind of region that tends to be quite conspicuous in biodiversity are in the Mediterranean climate. So that includes, of course, the Mediterranean region itself, also places like California, parts of South America, South Africa, and the far southwest of Australia. So these are sort of climatically unique environments. They get rainfall in the wintertime. They have hot, dry summers. They tend to have fire regimes that are important parts of their climate. Sort of climatically unique environments, but you tend to get some very high diversity in these areas. If we look at endemism, that is, the distribution of where species are locally endemic, the map is pretty similar to what we looked at there, but we see a couple of conspicuous differences. One is that the big areas of tropical forests, such as the Amazon basin and the Congo basin, largely drop out of the picture, and also Papua New Guinea, also New Guinea. But we also start picking, just simply because it's so large, but also we start picking up a lot of island systems like Micronesia and Polynesia and New Zealand, and also other areas that are sort of biogeographically distinctive and isolated. So for instance, some of these mountain ranges in parts of Asia, the Horn of Africa, some of these other different biogeographic regions, and of course the tropical mountains. So when we get lots of these restricted endemic species occurring in areas that are, for various reasons, have high diversity, but also tend to be sort of biogeographically distinctive from their surrounding environments. So then we kind of get, that's just sort of setting the stage here. We get to the issue of what is the future of biodiversity, and I think that this is an interesting question, and it raises a lot of important issues about some of the kinds of things that people here are interested in. If you read a lot of popular literature, and particularly if you read things in the last couple of decades, you've heard been a lot of discussion about the possibility that we could be entering one of the great extinction episodes on the planet Earth. We know there's been 5 of these really catastrophic extinction events in the past, the most recent being at the KT boundary when apparently a bolide, a meteor, wiped out the dinosaurs and a lot of other things. And the idea being that we may in fact be entering the 6th great extinction episode in the 4.5 billion year history of the planet. And this is something that's been discussed in lots of contexts, and a number of authors have argued this in the context of tropical forests. For instance, this is Rodolfo Dirzo at Stanford and Peter Raven, director of the Missouri Botanical Garden. In a 2003 paper, they argued that by the middle part of this century, that we might only have 5 to 10% of the world's old growth rainforests remaining, and as a consequence of that, using simple species area curves, that perhaps half to 3/4 of all the tropical species could either be extinct or committed to extinction and effectively doomed to extinction, part of the extinction debt, of course, that famous phrase that Dave Tillman and colleagues coined. So that's a pretty dramatic kind of projection. I mean, that's something that, that really shocks people, to say that unless business as usual changes, which is, the trajectory that we're currently on, we could lose an awful lot of the world's most biologically important real estate, and a lot of the biodiversity could disappear as a result. Now, in fact, I spent most of my career with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and one of my colleagues there, Joe Wright, and I'm sure you know Joe Wright's spouse, Helene Muller-Landau, who was formerly a faculty member here, produced a paper in 2006 that really put the cat amongst the pigeons, called The Future of Tropical Forest Species. And it's a very interesting, I would like to talk to you a little bit about some of their analysis. So this paper really challenged the idea that the scale of extinctions that have been projected by some people were likely to occur. And now, it was difficult to ignore them. You could say, well, anybody could stand up and say something like this. I mean, Fox News could say this, and no one would really, give them a lot of credence. But Joe and Helene were very prominent scientists. They both had very active publication records. Joe actually gave this while he was president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation as his presidential address. So talk about like a high-impact venue. Sort of people were hyperventilating in the audience as he was speaking. And then what he did, and this is the only part I think that perhaps rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, is they put out a press release. And the press release, if you read it, I'll show you their analysis. It has a whole set of assumptions and caveats and that type of thing. The press release didn't really mention any of this. The press release just said, don't worry, we don't really have to worry about all this tropical extinction stuff. It's not going to be anywhere near as bad as people have suggested. It's really been overstated. And now you can imagine something like that. There were a lot of people working in tropical conservation and other conservation were like, well, what should we do about this? Should we ignore it, hope it goes away, or do we need to respond? And so we started doing a bit of web surfing, and what we found is that this has gotten picked up. In fact, Fox News had it on their site, and lots of other conservative websites did too. And it was the tenor of these things were like, well, look, there's those greenies, those environmentalists again going on. There you go again. And clearly this is another case of them overstating what's going on. So we felt like some damage had actually been done and there was a need to respond. So we ended up, in fact, the Smithsonian thought this was a fun idea, that Joe and I were both having this big debate. And Joe and I are friends. We play racquetball and we argue between points and things. But they decided that wouldn't it be good if we had some debates? So they ended up organizing one in Mexico, and then we did another one in Panama, and finally said, look, let's do one in Washington, D.C. And the form of these things was that Joe got to choose people that supported his point of view, and I got to choose people that supported my point of view, and then we got to have this big debate. So that's what happened. And I have to say, Joe's a little bit more of a traditional scientist. I don't think he was entirely comfortable with sort of this whole way that this thing got promoted. I also know he didn't like the fact that I was on top. And things got a little polarized at times. I mean, some people were kind of starting to vilify Joe a little bit. He was getting sensitive about that, feeling that it was starting to, weigh a little bit on him. And I just tried to assure him that no matter, he would never have to worry about me as his colleague ever vilifying him or ever pretending to take the moral high ground as a part of this debate. Anyway. Their argument is an interesting one, and in fact, I'm going to walk you through it because, in fact, it is really interesting. It's empirically based, and I think it actually raises a number of very interesting issues. And so I wanted to sort of talk you through this and explain this, and then talk about some issues that I have with elements of it. The first part of the foundation of their argument is that if you look at tropical countries around the world, and this is for 45 tropical nations that have about 90% of the world's tropical forests, it turns out there's a very strong relationship between how many people you have, particularly how many rural people you have, and how much forest cover you have. Okay, so you can see here, now this is a logarithmic relationship, so that's the logarithm of population density there, and there's the amount of the original or total forest cover, that's total forest cover. And then you can see there's a very strong and basically linear relationship there. A line through that explains about 90% of the variation. So the first key thing about this argument is this. If you know how many people a country has or is going to have in the future, you can make a pretty good guess at how much forest cover it's likely to have. So that's the first part. The second part of the argument is that, in fact, there are data which make projections for different countries of the world and different regions of the world for how many people we're likely to have in the future. And one of the things that you see in developing nations in particular is we're seeing a very strong urbanization trend. So there's a lot of people, cities are growing very, very rapidly. You can see the curve here for cities, but rural populations are growing less rapidly. In fact, in many regions they're plateauing. Some parts of the world are even declining for various reasons. That trend doesn't really hold in Africa. There's still huge and growing rural populations in Africa, but in Asia and in Latin America, that trend is certainly prevailing. So the second part of their argument is that using these population projections, which are from the United Nations Population Division, using the median projection, we can take a pretty good stab at guessing how many people we're likely to have in the future, say for the instance the remainder of this century or the midpoint of this century. So that's the second part. The third part is that the good old species area relationship. If you know how many people you're going to have in the future, you can make a projection of how much less forest you're likely to have, and if you know how much less forest you're likely to have, you can then use the species area curve to estimate how many species you're likely to lose. So if you probably know from the species area relationship, there's all different forms of species area relationships, but you find them basically just about everywhere you go. And the classical form is mathematically something like that, but the typical rule of thumb with the species area curve is that if you lose 90% of your habitat, you tend to lose about half of your species. Okay, so lose 9/10 of the habitat and you tend to lose about half of the species overall. And I have to say there's a caveat, there's been a modification to this paper published by he and Hubble last year, which in fact shows that this traditional species area curve in fact overestimates extinctions. But that's a caveat we could talk about later if someone wants to know. So there's the three pieces of the puzzle there. One, you can make projections about how many people you're likely to have in the future. Two, if you can do that, you can estimate how much forest cover you're likely to have. Three, if you know how much less forest you're likely to have, in most cases less forest, you can then make projections of how many species you're likely to lose. And if you do that, it turns out you don't get 50 to 75% of the species projected to disappear. You get much lower figures. So here, they get a projection of 21 to 24% of species in the Asian tropics and 16 to 35% of species in the African tropics. And in the New World tropics, the figure is considerably lower. For technical reasons, they couldn't actually generate a projection, but because of the vastness of the Amazon basin, it's pretty clear that the figure would be lower. So those numbers are a lot lower than 50 to 75%, but importantly, they regard these numbers as very much top-end estimates. In fact, they don't think that we're going to see anything like these proportions of species going extinct. Why is that? Well, there's a set of arguments for this. One is that, and I think that they're probably correct in this, I don't think that this in fact is really that disputable, is one of their arguments is that if you look at the assumptions that go into things like the IUCN Red Data Book, when they look at the different categories of endangered and critically endangered and the proportion of those species that should disappear in the future as a result of all kinds of processes, the proportions of species that are disappearing today are not as high as many people had assumed in the past. Why? We're not sure. But it just seems that a lot of species are able to cling to survival in small, relic, fragmented populations than many people had presumed. Maybe they're doomed to extinction in the future. Maybe they're not. No one's really quite sure about that. It's clear that in some cases, some of these things have survived in these tiny relic populations because there's been heroic and very expensive efforts to try to save these things, like, for instance, the Javan rhino. But in other cases, we're just not sure. But I don't think that, in fact, that point can be argued, and I've talked to several people that worked on this, that the endangered species don't seem to be vanishing as fast as some people had assumed. The second part of their argument, remember, is that we're seeing a lot of outmigration in rural areas. We're seeing a lot of urbanization trends, and a lot of that's happening because people in some parts of the tropics, not all, but in some parts of the tropics are moving out of rural areas and tending to move more into cities. Now, I think that's incredibly heterogeneous, but that's a broad trend which seems to be happening. And their argument is, as people move out of these rural areas, there's going to be more forest regeneration. And so you might have species persisting in remnants of forest, but there's secondary forest coming in, and that should help to provide a buffer against extinction. And the third part of their argument is this. In fact, the world has already gone through some very severe extinction filters. A lot of the things, if something was really extinction prone, in fact, many of those species will already have vanished. Why? Well, for one thing, we've just gone through the Pleistocene, okay? We've just had maybe 20-odd major ice ages, and a lot of parts of the world, which could sustain a lot of species, have experienced severe change. For instance, the tropical forests of Africa probably contracted something like 90% in terms of their geographic distribution. Other parts of the tropics would have contracted as well, but it varies, it's highly variable. But we know that some areas of the tropics would have undergone these severe contractions, and some of the more area-dependent species might have disappeared as a result. Other areas of the tropics, for instance, in Mesoamerica, we know that there were large Mayan populations, and they cleared larger areas, much of the forest in Mesoamerica. And so that, as a consequence of that, species probably disappeared or may well have disappeared. And the other thing, really crucially, is that humans are this super consumer, this super predator. And as you see, as human populations expanded across the Earth to places like North America and to Europe and to Australia and to New Zealand and Madagascar, what happened? Mass extinctions. Humans wiped out megafauna again and again. It may have interacted with other kinds of environmental changes, like changes in fire regimes and things, but the bottom line is humans and the human-related environmental changes, and also species that humans brought in with them, such as rats and other things, have caused an awful lot of species to disappear already. So that's the Wright and Muller-Landau argument. Okay, you put all these numbers together and they don't give you huge numbers of extinctions, and you look at these other caveats and factors and they argue that in fact they militate towards a projection of much lower extinctions than many people had argued in the past. So you can imagine, I mean, that's an interesting argument. It's empirical, largely. It's got a lot of specific assumptions in it, or it's got a lot of elements to it, and it's really gotten people thinking. There's now been dozens of papers that have been produced in response to this whole thing, and some of them quite heated, and there's been some heated interactions. I should perhaps mention Navjot Sodhi. Some of you would have known Navjot, well-known conservation biologist. There's some really intense debates that people got into. Navjot told Joe Wright in front of about 500 people in Australia, I'm not going to say exactly what he told him to do, but it's a physical act that would be technically impossible. Let's just leave it that way. So it did get heated up at times. But I do think that, hang on just a second, I do think that, in fact, there's some important caveats to the Wright and Muller-Landau analysis, and I want to just quickly touch on a few of these. One of the really important caveats here is that they're just looking at total forest cover, right? And so this includes all kinds of other things. It includes secondary forests. It includes log forests, includes fragmented forests, includes forests affected by edge effects, by overhunting, by surface fires, and importantly on top of all of that, it includes plantations, okay? So this includes rubber plantations and palm oil plantations, and palm plantations, and eucalyptus plantations, which we've seen very large expanding at a very high rate in many tropical countries. All of that stuff is being lumped in together and as forest cover, and the assumption, crucial assumption here, is that 100% of those habitat types sustain just as much biodiversity as intact old-growth rainforest, okay? I think that's a very risky assumption. In fact, I was one of several authors that produced a paper in 2011 in Nature, and this was just a big meta-analysis here. But you can see that this looks at this is the biodiversity value of old-growth rainforest. This is the biodiversity values, and we looked at this in different ways, but of different kinds of prevailing land use types in tropical forests. And you can see that most of these, with the one notable exception of selectively log native forest, which wasn't too bad, but basically almost all the others sustain much lower biodiversity than what you see in old growth forest. Another important thing to emphasize is that a lot of the biodiversity being found in these disturbed and degraded habitats, in fact, are in many cases overrepresented by cosmopolitan species and generalist things and things that have wide geographic ranges that basically we're just not too worried about. So that's one important caveat there. Another thing is that the Wright-Muller-Landau model is based on rural populations, and urban populations, as we've seen, are skyrocketing in many cases, and I think it's a real mistake to ignore those urban populations, because urban populations need energy, and they need minerals, and they need timber, and they need food, and all that stuff has to come from a growing environmental footprint that surrounds the city. So even though we might be seeing a trend of outmigration, people moving into cities, that certainly does not mean that there's not still a lot of intensive pressures on the land. In fact, we might actually see more agricultural intensification happening simply because that city needs to, all the people in that city need to be fed. So that's certainly a factor that's going to be contributing, I think, to overall environmental impacts and can't be ignored. Also, we're seeing, of course, huge increases in industrialization globally. Of course, the industrial countries are staying industrial, but also the emerging economies of China, India, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, and lots of other countries are becoming industrial too. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment suggests that there could be something like a 300 to 600% increase in global industrial activity by the middle part of this century, mostly because of the developing nations developing, of course, trying to attain the kinds of lifestyles that people in the industrial nations have enjoyed for a long time. And this is playing out in lots of ways, and in some cases this is having very important impacts on land use. One of the ways that it's important is that if you see what drives deforestation, or what has driven deforestation, you go back and you read the literature in the 1970s and 1980s, even up in the 1990s, what they were talking about was this. These were seen as the drivers of deforestation here. Little guys, okay? The 800 million to 1 billion people living out in tropical frontier regions. So these are small-scale farmers, small-scale landowners, some cases indigenous peoples, that type of thing. All of these peoples, these settlers and migrants and other people living out in the frontier regions, that was seen as a major driver of deforestation. But increasingly, as the world has become more industrialized and more globalized, what we're seeing is it's not so much little guys, with machetes and chainsaws. It's big guys with bulldozers and skidders and other heavy equipment, which are clearing a lot of the forest. So it's not as though those 800 million or billion people have gone away, but increasingly what we now have is industrial agriculture and oil and gas exploration and development and mineral development and industrial logging and industrial plantations and all kinds of other, and infrastructure expansion adding on to that impact, also destroying forest, but also crucially creating the economic impetus for a lot of road building and other infrastructure expansion, which is opening up yet more areas for exploitation. So it's the synergism of all this going on. Now, and a really important thing about this is, remember, the whole Wright Muller-Landau analysis was based on this fundamental relationship between how many people you have and how much forest destruction or habitat destruction you're likely to get. But what happens is, as industrialization increases, I think what you tend to get, and Joe Wright concedes this, is you get changes in the relationship between population density and forest loss. So what we see here for the states of the Brazilian Amazon, here's population, again, a logarithm of population density. This is the amount of old growth forest remaining. This is the slope of that relationship in 1980. So it's a fairly shallow slope, which means on average, each person isn't destroying all that much forest. You can see here in 1991, that slope has become, this is, by the way, really hassle trying to use this little cursor here. 1991, that relationship gets steeper, and in 2000 it gets steeper still, which is indicating that on average each person is destroying more and more forest. Well, why is that? Well, again, because it's not little guys with machetes and chainsaws, it's big guys with bulldozers and skidders and other heavy equipment, which is doing a lot of forest destruction, I would argue. So for instance, in Brazil, we're seeing, timber, a big increase in the industrial timber industry. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's been a massive increase in cattle ranching. Brazil's gone from having 20 million head of cattle in 1990 in the Amazon to 80 million head of cattle today. And most of these are not on small-scale farms. They're largely on very big cattle ranches, large, with wealthy landowners. Also, we're seeing a lot of infrastructure expansion. Industrial soy farming is about a $10 billion a year export industry in Brazil. So the drivers of deforestation have shifted in many ways. There's still small-scale landowners, and there's still all those pressures, but also we have these industrial drivers, which are becoming much more important. And then finally, another important caveat is that, remember, the Wright and Muller-Landau analysis is just based on land use change. It's just particularly based on deforestation. But in fact, that, of course, that does not capture a lot of the other environmental changes that are happening on the planet Earth today. The most obvious one, of course, is climate change. Now, that's a giant area of uncertainty, and there's it's almost certain it's very likely, however, that climate change is going to be an increasingly important cause of environmental change. And I think in some kinds of tropical environments, particularly higher elevation tropical environments, where we get a lot of local endemics, a lot of those things are going to see their geographic ranges contracting and shrinking as a consequence of global warming, because many of them are very thermally specialized. Their model doesn't include forest degradation, as we already discussed. There are lots of emerging pathogens happening today. I mean, the chytrid fungus alone that we talk here about has already caused the global extinction of at least 200 species of frogs, and it's still going. So, and there's many other pathogens that are causing impacts on wildlife. And then it also doesn't include environmental synergisms. I mean, tell me one place on the planet Earth that's being affected by one environmental change. I don't think you can. I don't think there is such a place, okay? Everywhere is being affected by multiple environmental changes of varying levels of importance. So the net impact on nature is not just a single change, but it's that combination of changes. And the analogy I would sometimes use would be if humankind was in a boxing match with nature, it's not just, a jab. It's not just like one punch and that's it. It's a flurry of punches. It's a series of blows landing simultaneously, and that's the net impact on natural ecosystems and on biodiversity. So there's a whole set of caveats, and what I think that really says to me is the Wright and Muller-Landau analysis, I actually think, has focused attention on a lot of very interesting issues that we need to know more about. And it's actually stimulated a lot of empirical work. The big thing that we're seeing in the tropics these days is a shift away from areas that have large expanses of old growth forest. They're much more complex human-dominated landscapes. So they might have remnant patches of forest, some log forest, secondary forest, a lot of agricultural land, urbanization, and the question is, how will biodiversity fare in these human-dominated lands? That's an increasingly relevant kind of question. So where does this leave us? Well, again, I think it leaves us with a lot of uncertainty. A couple of things that I would highlight are these. One is, I think, these biodiversity hotspots, which I think just about everybody is aware, the 35 biodiversity hotspots really are important real estate. As you probably know, these are areas that are defined by Conservation International as having more than 1,500 locally endemic plant species and more than 70% habitat loss. In fact, in many cases, they have much more than 70% habitat loss. Of course, this was all famously published in this paper by Norman Myers and Russ Mittermeier and others in 2000 in Nature. By the way, that's now the most highly cited paper in all of environment and ecology. So it's a very high impact paper. Science rejected it before Nature took it. So science is still crying about this, I'm sure. But anyway, these biodiversity hotspots encompass about 15% of the world's land surface. And I'm not talking about marine ecosystems here at all, but there's marine hotspots as well, but just talking about the land. But about 15% of the land surface. But if you just look at the remaining intact habitat, it's well less than 2%, okay? So less than 2% of the planet sustains an awful lot of the planet's biodiversity and an awful lot of our local endemism. So what happens to those hotspots is really important. Unfortunately, what you see is a lot of the hotspots are coincident with areas that have high population density, that have rapidly growing populations, and also what you tend to see, and this is an analysis by Jha and Bawa, found that the forest loss is occurring most rapidly in hotspot nations that have high population growth and also poor human development. So that means things like low levels of adult literacy, high levels of poverty, high infant mortality, poor governance, other issues like that. So, we've really got some serious challenges in these hotspot areas, and they're getting even hotter over time. Another thing is protected areas. I mean, the good news, and there really is some good news here, is that the world's protected area network has increased substantially. In the last 25 years, basically, the network has tripled, and now about 13% of the world's terrestrial surface has got some kind of protection, some kind of legal protection. Some cases it's just a paper park, in some cases it's better protected. If you look at the areas that are supposed to be fully protected, it's about 6%. So that would include national parks, World Heritage areas, things like that. So about 6% of the planet is supposed to be fully protected right now. But in fact, we just recently completed an analysis where we looked, using the best available information, at key groups of biodiversity, key biodiversity indicators in 60 protected areas stratified across the world's major tropical regions to try to get a handle on what's really happening to the biodiversity in these areas. I just mentioned, by the way, this paper, one of the ways that we managed to get people to give us information was we made them co-authors. This paper had 215 co-authors. So I'm never collaborating with anyone again for the rest of my life after that experience. I'll tell you what, try to get 215 cats to all go in one direction was quite interesting. Anyway, what we found is interesting. What we found was that half of the reserves that we studied, in fact, weren't doing too badly. If you look at here's the proportions of the reserves that were increasing or improving for a range of different biodiversity indicators right here. And you can see that it's sort of a mixed bag here. Some of the indicators were improving, some of them are worsening, but overall, you could say, look, these protected areas were hanging in there. They were, they're certainly faring better than a lot of other habitats around them. They're battling, doing the best they can to kind of, to sustain biodiversity. Unfortunately, the other half of the reserves were faring much better. You can see they were overwhelmingly negative towards the fate of the different biodiversity indicators. So what that really says is that some of our protected areas are doing a pretty good job, and some of them, and we only had a sample of 60, so it's a very small sample, but they were sort of broadly stratified across the world, but it suggests a fairly high proportion of them are really suffering. So the question is, well, what is it about the reserves that cause them to suffer? And I think that there's probably a couple of fairly obvious things. One is that clearly reserves that are better protected, if they have more park guards, better infrastructure, the guards are motivated, they've got good environmental laws, all those things. If there's actual better on-the-ground protection inside the reserve, those reserves clearly fare better. But in addition to that, and this turned out to be just about as important, what's happening around the reserves is also really important. The conditions around the reserves tend to leak inside the reserves to a lesser degree. And you see this reflected when we looked at 21 different environmental drivers here, and you can see these are the correlations between those drivers inside the reserve and within a 3-kilometer zone immediately around the reserve. And you can see there's a very strong, there's strong positive correlations. For 17 of the 21 drivers, those correlations were statistically significant. For 13 of them, they were significant even using a pretty stringent Bonferroni correction. So the bottom line is these reserves are not independent of their surroundings. We cannot just set protected areas aside and say, okay, we've done our job and then we can forget about them now. That is a failing strategy. We have to think about these things embedded in landscapes, and we need multifunction landscapes, and there's a whole set of issues, connectivity and issues about trying to have a more benign type of matrix and trying to have other kinds of land management, engaging local communities, that type of thing. There's a whole set of issues here that are relevant. And unfortunately, what you see, if you look at the literature on this, and there's a lot of good remote sensing data coming to light now, many protected areas are very rapidly being changed. I mean, this is a national park where one of my PhD students is working in peninsular Malaysia. You can see here they're clearing right up to the edges of the park for oil palm plantations. This is a protected area where we're working in Gabon, in the Congo, and you can see here just outside the reserve, this was a young elephant it had a bullet hole in the back of its skull, but it must have escaped and died later because the tusks hadn't been removed. It was almost certainly shot for its tusks. But it just gives you an indication that there's a lot of pressures, increasing pressures, around many protected areas in the world. So, sort of coming back to this question, how much biodiversity are we likely to lose in the future? And I don't think there's any frank answer to this other than, wow, we don't know. I think actually the Wright and Muller-Landau paper has been interesting in that it's gotten people moving away from maybe these very blunt instruments, which are species area curves, and started thinking a little more about some of the details and empirical issues here. So I think, in fact, they've actually done us a real service with that. But again, there's it's an awful lot of issues that we need to explore better to understand what the fate of biodiversity is going to be. I think there's enormous uncertainty about the future. That having been said, I do, in fact, think there's perhaps 4 things you could say, at least, with strong confidence that you could. I believe you can argue emphatically are likely to occur in the future. First is that we talked about all this biodiversity that had not yet been described scientifically, all this missing biodiversity, the unknown biodiversity. In fact, I think a lot of these missing species are likely to be imperiled in the future. Why? Well, we know that a lot of these things are associated with biodiversity hotspots and with tropical forests. This is where a lot of these things are being discovered now and being described now. Also, we know one of the key reasons that many of them are missing is because they're local endemics. And local endemics just occur in a small part of the world, and if that small part of the world gets nuked, they're in a lot of trouble. Okay, so we know they're inherently vulnerable for that reason. So I think a lot of the missing biodiversity will in fact also be endangered biodiversity in many parts of the world. Secondly, even if the extinctions are not as rapid, the total species extinctions are not as rapid as have been suggested in the past, it's clear that right now and in the future we're seeing a great number of functional extinctions, and that is that species are becoming so rare that they're effectively the ecological role that they played in ecosystems is largely vanishing. This includes things like top predators, which of course are disappearing from many ecosystems, just big animals generally. Of course, top predators oftentimes play a very important role in terms of regulating prey populations. Tigers, for instance, they have a dominant impact not only on the abundances of ungulates, but also they affect their behavior and their habitat selection. That in turn affects plant communities. There's all kinds of ripples through the community. Big animals also, seed dispersers, all kinds of roles on vegetation. Old growth trees, we had a paper in Science last year where we argued that in fact old growth trees should be considered another one of these functional groups. The big tall trees that need a long time to achieve maturity and a long time to achieve their structure are also vanishing in many parts of the world. So a lot of these things are becoming very rare. The tiger today, for instance, survives in 7% of its original geographic range and about 5% of its original abundance. So you had this very dominant species, really had an important impact on the systems it affected, and it's largely gone. So I think that's a second thing we can say about the future. The third is that we're living in an era in which the ecosystems that are remaining in many cases are being ecologically distorted, and they're also being homogenized. If you think about it, we're removing a lot of key species from ecosystems, and also we're changing disturbance regimes in lots of ways, via fires, via fragmentation, via a whole set of different kinds of processes. And also, what's happening, of course, humans are incredibly good at moving species around. We know that we look everywhere, we see exotic plants, we see exotic animals, and also we see exotic pathogens. There's just an incredible array of species that we have moved across the planet. As you well know, some people have argued that we shouldn't in fact call the current era the Holocene. We should actually call it the Homogeocene, because that's really what we're doing to the planet is we're homogenizing the biota. But I think that in fact that what we're going to see are ecosystems that are, in many ways modified. They're going to be distorted ecologically, trophically distorted, structurally distorted, and different carbon storage, all kinds of things. And they're also going to, of course, be suffering from many invasions of exotic species. And then a final one, of course, is loss of genetic variation. We've talked about the fact that this is the fuel, of course, for evolution, and of course it's fundamental for the long-term persistence of species. The iconic example of this is the cheetah. As you may well have heard, you can actually take a skin graft off of one cheetah, you can put it onto another cheetah, and it'll take, okay? It seems that there's very little, almost no genetic variability among cheetahs. They've evidently undergone some kind of catastrophic genetic bottleneck in the past and lost much of their genetic variation. So if some kind of new pathogen or some kind of new environmental insult comes along, cheetahs have very little genetic variability to try to manage that into the future. Now, to an audience like this, I don't need to try to convince you that biodiversity is important. It's interesting, this exercise here, the TEEB exercise, went through and tried to estimate how much is biodiversity actually worth in monetary terms to humankind. And it's looking at the whole range of benefits from germplasm to pollination to carbon storage to lots of other things. And the net number was on the order of roughly $2 trillion a year. And we're talking some pretty serious money here, sort of the net value of biodiversity. And then finally, of course, biodiversity is important. It's not just important for tree huggers and for people that like to see the world. Really, biodiversity is a barometer. It's sort of a canary in the coal mine. If we don't sustain a planet with large numbers of biodiversity, we're probably not going to have a world that's very good for us and for our children and our grandchildren. So one thing I would just say in ending, I absolutely am not, I would never preach gloom and pessimism. I think, in fact, we live in a world today in which there's incredible opportunities to change things. I mean, if you're interested in the environment, this is the time to be alive. I mean, there's probably no time in human history when changes have been more profound and more rapid. The world can go in lots of different trajectories. Clearly, we're going to face some enormous environmental challenges as human populations increase, as consumption increase, and many people here working on these kinds of issues. But I also think it's a prime time to be engaged in these issues. And one of the things that you see is that so few people actually go out and get engaged. That one of the points I always try to make is that if you are willing to take your knowledge and actually go out and engage in the world and really do something, one person can have the impact of 10,000. So yes, we're facing a lot of challenges. Yes, we're facing a lot of uncertainties, but it's a fantastic time to be alive. It's a great time. If you're interested in the environment, it's really an opportunity of a lifetime. So, thanks.